as a consultant, we work on a lot of projects where our clients are asking us to help them think through their future or target state of what they want to do, right? And they're really anxious to figure out what the future looks like, and they get kind of frustrated when we say, well, yeah, but before we do that, we have to look at your current state first. We have to understand where you are first before we tell you where you want to go. And they kind of, sort of scratch their heads at that and say, well, why is that? And why you need to do that? And I think a lot of it's because by doing that, you understand what the processes are, where you can drive improvement. And by the way, spoiler alert, not every answer is AI, right? So let's, so I think that's another thing that this assessment will discover. But don't take a consultant's word for it, take an actual banker's word for it. So Jason's gonna talk a little bit about seeing clarity in your organization, and he'll hit on some of these topics. So Jason, come on up.
All right, I am going to have the least technology-focused presentation of the entire BTS. So I'm an IT guy, but we're not going to talk about technology. I'm not selling you products, services, cores, anything like that. So let's dig in. So I want to ask you something. How many of you right now are absolutely certain that the way you're running your organization is based on reality? Not habit, not what's comfortable, but actual reality. It's a hard question. What I'm going to share with you today is wisdom from the ancients, believe it or not. Most organizations, I believe, are watching shadows on a wall. They're watching what they see, they're watching perception, and it's not reality. So we're going to talk about a story from Plato. It's 2,400 years old, and I think it has a lot of wisdom today. My name is Jason Tilley. I'm the Chief Information Officer for First Advantage Federal Credit Union. I've been in this industry for about 30 years, and I've seen firsthand the shadows on the wall and how organizations interpret that as their reality. So let's talk a little bit about that. First, let's talk about Plato's Allegory of the Cave. So I'll give you the 1 minute synopsis because there's a timer right here that's freaking me out. Plato's Allegory of the Cave is this. There are prisoners that were born in a cave. They're chained up in a cave. They can't turn their heads, and all they can see are shadows on a wall. The shadows are cast by a fire that's behind them, and occasionally people walk between the fire and the prisoners, and they're carrying symbols, and they cast shadows on the wall. So the prisoners see that as their reality. That's the only reality they know. That's the only reality that exists to them. So Plato asks, what happens if one of those prisoners leaves the cave? What happens if they free their head and they look behind them and they see the fire? What happens? What happens to their reality when that happens? So that's the question we're going to explore here. I'm going to modernize this a little bit. My wife is smarter than I am, and she said this is kind of a heavy topic. So caves are not a problem anymore. We figured out how to get out of a cave. So we're going to modernize it a little bit. Meet Brad. Brad and his friends are stuck in their parents' basement. That's where they live. They've been there for a long time, but since the pandemic, they've been there a lot more than they have in the past. Brad is stuck in his cave. He sees shadows on the wall, but the shadows for him are cast by the soft glow of a LCD monitor. That monitor serving up shadows, but it's also serving up algorithmically curated content. Something that, again, isn't necessarily reality. He's seeing influencers. He's seeing a lot of things that may appear to be real, but in reality, real reality is not. So, does that sound familiar? In your organizations, do you have processes today that are just the way we've always done it? Do you have processes today that existed when you started and have just continued on and on and on over the years? I would imagine the answer to that question is yes. So in banking and in credit unions, and whether you're a tiny $100 million credit union or you're a multinational, supermassive financial institution or a fintech, we love our fintechs. we have to realize that we are all in a cave of some kind, and there are shadows on the wall. And what you see is oftentimes a shadow. And it's important to realize that, because if you don't, you're going to make decisions based on something that really isn't a reality. So what are our shadows? Maybe they're legacy systems. Maybe they're lack of standardized processes. Maybe, you're basing your reality and what you do on outdated information. Or maybe it's information that's in a 30-year tenured employee's head and doesn't exist in a policy manual, procedure manuals. Maybe those things don't get updated on a regular basis. That's your shadow on the wall. So what do we do to combat those shadows? Okay, so the difficult part is, how do we break free from that prison? How do we break free from the cave or our parents' basement? So the first step is always the hardest. You have to admit you're in the cave. You have to admit that what you're seeing isn't reality. It requires courage, real courage, not courage to have a fight. This isn't a battle, but it's courage to question what is reality. Because, at the end of the day, it really isn't a reality. So it's difficult to take some time and look at those things. You need to question, why does it take maybe 3 days to open an account on your floor? And I'm going to give you some examples from I'm a smaller fish in a much larger pond. My credit union is about $1.5 billion worth of assets. But these examples scale. So a much larger institution has more complex problems and maybe dealing with international payments and money movement, things like that a smaller institution wouldn't, but the lessons are the same. You've got challenges, you've got business processes that exist that maybe are not as optimal as they could be. So what are you doing to sit down and take a look at those processes and try to find ways to make them a little bit more efficient? So the examples scale, but so do the solutions. The solutions are how you break the chains of the cave that you're in. So here's what happens. When you start questioning these things, you're going to get pushback. You're going to get, people in the cave, the other prisoners, questioning your reality, what's real. So you're going to hear things like, well, that's the way we've always done it, or we're different. I think I heard somebody up on stage here a little earlier say, we're different. You're right. Everybody does things a little bit differently, but at the end of the day, an inefficient process is still an inefficient process. It doesn't matter if you're a $500 billion institution or a $500 million institution. Inefficiency is inefficiency. So that is something you're going to hear a lot, but it's not something that, in my mind, really should determine whether or not you engage in a process to make your processes more productive and more efficient. So when you hear those things, those are the chains talking. Those are the chains that are restraining folks inside that cave or that basement. And the reason, you're hearing those things is because that's comfortable. That's what you know. That's what you've always done. So it's challenging. It's difficult to make that change and switch to something that's completely foreign. So once you break those chains, it doesn't make the process any easier. We are all here today at BTS. We're learning some really, really good information from a lot of really smart people, most of them smarter than myself. But when you start looking at some of your systems and some of the operational efficiencies that you can get, then you start to identify that there are things that matter more than the way that we've always done it. You start looking at things like operational efficiency and real-time data, and actually look at your members or customers as more than just a checking account or a savings account or a loan. You look at them through a lens of life changes. So you start to take a look at the world around you with a different set of glasses. And I think taking that information and using it, you can realize that you find processes that are dependent on a very tenured employee that maybe isn't serving your membership or your customer base as well as you might think. Even though they've always done it this way, there are definitely better ways to do some of these things. So once you commit to breaking those chains, once you commit to the idea of there's something better and what I'm seeing is shadows on a wall as opposed to actual reality, then there are things that come to light. Plato describes the moment when the prisoner finally exits the cave as blinding and disorienting. His eyes hurt because he'd never seen the sun before. He saw a shadow on the wall, which was in the shape of a sun, but he's never seen the sun before. So for him, this was completely disorienting. So for him, the escaped prisoner, he's looking around at three-dimensional things, which just made no sense to him in the original world that he lived in, because that wasn't for him reality. So what do you do in that situation? Okay? So when you break the chains and you're outside the cave, what do you see? For the first time, you start to see true operational excellence. You'll see real-time data on member behavior. You'll see systems that actually talk to each other, API integrations that previously were unheard of. There's been a lot of talk about core modernization and things like that. Those are table stakes in order to sort of reframe your mindset and come up with something that makes more sense based on today's reality. Is anyone comfortable having a legacy mainframe COBOL-based system, and feeling comfortable in deploying AI or deploying anything new? Probably not. So, you need to kind of take a look at those things and organizationally accept the fact that it's time to make some changes. That's transformative. You need to see your organization as an integrated system, not as independent silos kind of competing for budget or territory and things like that. You need to kind of take an overall look from the balcony at the dance floor, not as somebody standing on the dance floor doing the dancing. So in Plato's Allegory, the freed prisoner, as we are going to do, returns back to the cave. So he's outside, he frolics around, he sees the grass, he sees what reality is. Brad, same thing, he goes outside, he goes to a Starbucks, he sees all of the new things in the world, and he's amazed. And he comes back because he wants to help his friends. He wants to liberate them because they're still stuck in the cave. So what do? So the prisoner comes back and he talks to his friends who are still in the cave, and the prisoners think he's insane. They think he completely lost his mind. Is that any different than where we're at now? We are at BTS. A lot of us were at conferences over the last few months and all year long. We've learned a lot of good things. When we go back to the office, do we always get full adoption? Do we always get full budget for these things? Absolutely not. So I think it's very, very similar. The prisoners, in some of the stories, in some of the retellings of Plato's Allegory, in some of those, the prisoners actually kill the freed prisoner trying to liberate them. So, I don't think my CFO or CEO is going to kill me when I come back with a really exorbitant budget, but, metaphorically, probably. So let's talk about what this journey looks like in practical terms. So in a cave, that's where most of us start. We've got legacy core banking platforms, outdated systems that don't talk to each other, policies and procedures that probably haven't been updated in a decade, if at all. You're making decisions based on legacy data and oftentimes stale data. Then we have the journey. This is the hard part. This is where the rubber meets the road. Digital transformation initiatives that actually connect systems to one another and provide real-time analytical insights. That's reality. That's what your Chimes and all of your fintechs are doing today at scale. They can provide hyper-personalized experiences via a hyper-personalized and a hyper-efficient delivery channel. We need to do some things that are similar to that. But when you get there, you start to see some of the benefits of that. Real-time analytics, you start to see your members as people that are going through life events and that are experiencing the world as they encounter it out in the real world, not in a cave or not in a basement. So how do we do that? How do we get there? I will say as transformation chaperones, we're here at BTS learning how to foment banking transformation. So what are some of the characteristics that I think are helpful to that? So I think you need to have vision. You need to be able to show people that they're in a cave. You need to be able to demonstrate that there's maybe a better way to do some things. You need to certainly be aware of every behavior and really understand that resistance isn't because somebody is stupid. It isn't because somebody is difficult. And a lot of times it's just breaking those chains are incredibly complicated and incredibly difficult. So you need to be aware of those limitations and address them. You need to be iterative, lead like a scientist, iterate, try things, and if they fail, fail fast and move on to the next thing. Be helpful at trying to have people understand what you're trying to tell them. You're not going to drag people into the light. You're just going to kind of facilitate that movement. You need to be a communicator. You have to make sure that this is not a top-down pronouncement from on high. This has to be two-way communication from the bottom up and from the top down. You need to get that, and you need to be open to receive that communication from the bottom up. Get feedback from where your staff and your organization are still feeling the pains of being in the cave. Sometimes it's hard to change those things. You need the feedback from the end users to understand how you need to pivot and reframe the question so that you can help them understand where the light is. And then the last one is you need to have discipline. I think it's important to embrace methodologies and systems and processes that exist today in order to be effective. You can't just show up and say, I've got a new way, you're all in a cave, just follow me. As much as I would love that, as narcissistic as I am, I feel like that's probably not going to be successful. So wherever possible, embrace a system or a methodology. Plato gives us some good lessons, but he's not the only one. Socrates is all about questioning and leading people to ask those questions. Okay, his whole idea is you're not going to convince somebody of something that they're not going to be receptive to. So have them ask the questions, have them identify this thing on their own. You can kind of trick them into it. Get them to ask the right questions, and they're going to finally do it your way, my way, which I love. And then we have Heraclitus. Heraclitus' claim to fame is that change is inevitable. That's the only thing that's constant. Everything else is what it is, but change is the only thing that constantly repeats over and over again. And then Taoism and Lao Tzu, the belief there is that you follow the river. Don't swim against the river. You find the path of least resistance and you set your boat in that river and you let it take you along. So taking some of that wisdom, I think, is super helpful in order to drive some organizational change. So the other thing is there are modern tools today. So I put a few of my favorites up here. There's a book by a gentleman by the name of William Donaldson. His book is called Simple Complexity. It's a much longer title, but it's about systems thinking and understanding that a thing that's here is probably part of a much larger system. And understanding that it's just a step along the way, and part of a larger journey is super important. There's the 4 Disciplines of Execution, multiple books by Peter Drucker, all of those things, super helpful. We also had a good speaker yesterday, Arcana Carpenter. She talked about the AI mind block. I think she had a lot of really good information there, so I would seek her out as well. I am not familiar with any of her work, but I'm going to be because I learned something in this cave here. So let's kind of bring this home. Banking transformation, credit union transformation, any organizational transformation that's not just about technology. As much as I would love to say it's all about me as a CIO, it's not about technology, it's about the people and about changing the mindsets of those people so that you can apply technology, you can apply systems to making your organization better. It's about leadership, it's not about management. Okay? It's about leading the folks out of the cave and leading them to even understand that they're in the cave. So here's my sort of closing question to you. When you go back to your buildings, when you go back to your, in some cases, countries, are you willing to step into that light of transformation? Are you ready to sort of embrace the change that comes with that and be a supporter in your organization for that change? The question isn't whether or not the world is changing. It is. Your customers, your members, your employees live in the real world. It's when they come into your office that they're in the cave. So if you're willing to kind of take that journey and liberate yourself from the cave, I think breaking the chain is a very difficult step, but one that's certainly worthy of our effort. So thank you. I'd be happy to take questions. We have 36 seconds. Otherwise, I'll be there with you. Thank you.